The stench hit me first. It wasn't just unpleasant. It was enough to make even the most hardened courtiers gag and vomit right there in front of the crown. I remember the dogs, too, slipping between the guards, their tongues greedily lapping at the dark, foul liquid seeping from King Henry VIII's coffin. In the next few minutes, I'm going to walk you through the medical evidence, real, documented proof, that explains how Henry went from the radiant, athletic prince everyone adored to a hulking 400-pound shadow of himself. This isn't rumor or gossip. This is drawn straight from newly examined records kept by his personal physicians, paired with modern forensic analysis of his actual remains. But to make sense of it, I need to take you back, step by step, and show exactly how England's most powerful ruler ended up as a grotesque shell of a man. Because once you hear this, you'll never look at the Tudor dynasty the same way again. We're talking about a man who beheaded 2 wives, tore apart England's religion, and reshaped the nation in his own image. And yet, his end was so gruesome, so humiliating, that the government hid the truth for more than 4 centuries. Now, those secrets are finally out, and they all trace back to one event: a brutal jousting accident that began a slow, unseen rot inside his body. And if this is already something you've never heard before, do me a small favor, hit that like button. It'll help others uncover this buried piece of history. Because what I'm about to share with you contains 3 revelations that will completely rewrite your image of the Tudors. So picture this. January 24th, 1536. Greenwich Palace. I can see it as if I'm standing there now. Henry VIII, still strong at 44, sits tall atop his towering warhorse, ready to prove he's still the warrior king of old. The crowd holds its breath as he lowers his lance, eyes fixed on his opponent. Sunlight flashes off his custom-forged armor, every plate worth more than most men could earn in a lifetime. Beneath us, the ground shakes with the pounding of hooves as 2 armored giants thunder toward one another at terrifying speed. And then something goes wrong, terribly wrong. The horses crash together with the force of a modern car accident. In an instant, Henry's massive, 300-pound frame, man and steel together, slams into the frozen earth. Gasps erupt from the stands as his destrier, a warhorse bred for battle, stumbles and collapses beside him. The great beast, his warhorse, was clad in its own heavy armor. When it went down, it crashed straight onto the king's body with a sickening weight. The tilt yard fell into a dead silence. Not a cough, not a whisper, just the cold air and the sound of creaking armor settling into the dirt. Every courtier stood frozen, as if moving might somehow seal the king's fate. Was Henry dead? Had England just lost its monarch to a game of sport? For 2 long hours, Henry VIII lay completely unconscious. 2 hours in which the kingdom effectively had no ruler. 2 hours where Anne Boleyn, heavily pregnant and praying for the son who might secure her place, waited in agonized suspense. 2 hours that would alter the course of England's history forever. When he finally stirred, those who were close enough to see his face noticed something unsettling. The eyes that once sparkled with wit, charm, and sharp intelligence now carried a different fire, colder, darker, and far less predictable. And his first words? Not relief that he had survived. Not gratitude for those who stood watch over him. No, he exploded into fury, demanding to know why the joust had been stopped. The man who had once been the perfect Renaissance prince, a king who spoke 4 languages, who wrote poetry and composed music, who danced until dawn and debated theology with Europe's finest scholars, never truly returned from that tilt yard. In his place was a new Henry, paranoid, mercurial, and prone to violent mood swings that would terrify his court for the next 11 years. Modern neuroscientists, poring over the accounts of his behavior, now suspect that Day left him with a traumatic brain injury, damage to the frontal lobe, the very part of the brain that governs personality, judgment, and impulse control. And the evidence is hard to ignore. Before that accident, Henry's reign was comparatively measured for a monarch of his age. He had been married to Catherine of Aragon for more than 2 decades before seeking to end the union. Executions, while never absent from his rule, were relatively rare compared to the bloodbaths of earlier kings. But after January of 1536, the killing began in earnest. And Boleyn's head rolled from the block just 4 months after that fateful day. Not long after, Thomas Cromwell, the man who had been Henry's most trusted advisor, met the same fate. By then, the king's tempers had become infamous. Servants whispered of a ruler who could be found sobbing uncontrollably in the morning, only to demand executions by nightfall. But the head injury, that was only the start of his descent. The accident that had scrambled his mind also awakened something far worse, a wound that would quite literally rot him from the ground up. Here's the part most people miss. Henry had injured his leg years before, likely in yet another jousting mishap. Back then, it had healed well enough, leaving only a faint scar. But in 1536, when he was thrown from his horse, that old injury split wide open. And in Tudor England, without antibiotics, antiseptics, or even a basic grasp of how infection worked, an open wound wasn't just a health problem, it was a slow-motion death sentence. Imagine living for 11 years with ulcers the size of tennis balls on both legs. Not for days, not for weeks, 11 years. Always raw, always leaking pus, never closing, never allowing a moment's relief. The pain was so severe that even the soft brush of silk sheets could make him howl. Dr. Thomas Vicary, Henry's court physician, left behind secret notes, records hidden for centuries in the archives of the Royal College of Physicians and only brought to light in the 1960s. In them, he describes ulcers of a grievous nature, stinking and painful beyond measure. The treatment was as grim as the condition. His legs had to be drained every single day, sometimes twice. Bronze bowls filled with foul, infected fluid would be whisked away by servants, desperate to get the smell out of the royal chambers. And yet, Henry, ever vain and increasingly paranoid, refused to accept the truth of his decline. Instead, he had special garters made, lined with lead weights, designed to press the wounds shut. He believed the pressure would force them to heal. Didn't. Instead, it cut off his circulation and drove the infection even deeper. He tried to disguise it, of course. The king drenched himself in the finest perfumes Arabia could offer. Rose oil mixed with ambergris. An exotic blend so costly that only a monarch could afford to burn it away daily. The goal was simple, to smother the stench of decay that clung to him. Even his portraits became weapons of illusion. He ordered his painters to give him the legs of a champion, thick and powerful, standing wide in that iconic power pose we all know, the image of strength hiding a reality of rot. But the truth was far uglier. The infection wasn't just consuming his legs, it was poisoning his entire body. Day after day, toxins from the decaying tissue seeped into his blood, riding the currents to his heart, his liver, and, most dangerously, his brain. Modern medical analysis of the symptoms described by his contemporaries points to a diagnosis: chronic osteomyelitis, a bone-deep infection, constantly releasing bacteria and inflammatory chemicals into his system. The effects would have been relentless. The pain alone. Imagine the most agonizing toothache you've ever endured, but lodged in your legs, unending, for over a decade. Fevers would come and go, one day soaking his clothes in sweat, the next leaving him shivering like a man in winter. His appetite would veer wildly, swinging from waves of nausea to ravenous, uncontrollable hunger. But the worst damage was to his mind. The toxins breaching the blood-brain barrier didn't just cloud his thoughts, they rewired them. His moods could pivot in an instant, roaring with laughter one moment, condemning the very same fool to death the next. Paranoia seeped into every corner of his life. He imagined poison in his meals. He saw betrayal in his wife's eyes. He was certain assassins lurked in the shadows of every hall. By 1540, just 4 years after the Tilt Yard accident, 2 queens had been destroyed, his second wife executed, his third marriage annulled, and already he was on the hunt for number 4. That search ended with Catherine Howard, a girl barely 17, standing before a king now 50. The contrast between them must have been grotesque. And yet, in Henry's mind, it was simply the privilege of a monarch. By this point, Henry was so enormous, He couldn't mount his horse without several strong servants hauling him into the saddle. Yet he still chased his teenage bride, Catherine Howard, a girl who, according to court whispers, found his touch so revolting she needed wine to face his bed. But worse was coming, when those long festering leg wounds finally turned septic. The year 1542 marked a dark turning point. For 6 years the ulcers had been grotesque but stable, oozing, foul, yet manageable. Then everything changed. Dr. Vickery's private notes tell it plainly. The discharge, once a pale yellow-white, shifted to green, then a deep rotting brown. The smell, already foul, became what witnesses called the stench of death itself. Henry's health began to collapse. Unable to move far without agony, he buried himself in food, eating endlessly to distract from the pain. His weight, already an immense 280 pounds, climbed past 350. You can see the evidence today. His 1540 armor in the Tower of London was built for a 48-inch waist. By 1545, new armor was forged for a waist of 54 inches. 54. Wider than most modern refrigerators. Even the palaces had to change. Doorways were widened for him to pass through. At Hampton Court, the marks from carpenter's tools remain. Floors were reinforced with heavy beams after his weight made them sag dangerously beneath the throne. Special chairs were built with removable arms. Henry could no longer fit between them. But it wasn't just the furniture that needed altering. His daily routine became an elaborate act to disguise his decline. He was dressed while still lying in bed, for servants required to maneuver his massive limbs. Pulleys and slings were fixed to lift him upright. From there, he was moved into a wheeled chair, though this was always hidden from the public eye. I have 2 more shocking revelations about his death and the cover-up that followed. But first, make sure you're subscribed because I've got a full series on Tudor conspiracies that most historians would rather you never hear. By 1544, his physical decay was matched by an even darker mental collapse. Courtiers spoke of behavior that went beyond bad temper into madness. He would hold conversations with people who weren't there. Some saw him argue with his dead father, Henry VII, defending his spending of the royal treasury. He called out for his mother, Elizabeth of York, gone since he was 11. Worst were the moments he spoke to the ghosts of his victims. Witnesses saw him freeze mid-sentence, his face turning pale, staring into empty air. He would murmur, "Not now or leave me be," before exploding at baffled advisors. The French ambassador recorded one chilling episode. Henry suddenly screaming at an empty chair, ordering Anne Boleyn to stop laughing at him. His paranoia peaked. He became convinced servants were trying to poison him through his leg bandages. Henry demanded that his pus-soaked bandages be brought to him for inspection, sniffing them suspiciously before ordering them burned. He even hired tasters not just for his food, but for his medicines, forcing unlucky servants to rub his ointments on their own skin first to prove they weren't poisoned. By Christmas of 1546, he was barely recognizable as human. Witnesses describe a massive figure slumped in his throne, unable to stand without help. His face was swollen to nearly twice its normal size, distorted by fluid buildup. Those famous blue eyes, once compared to summer skies by poets, had turned yellow and bloodshot, buried in dark, sagging pouches of flesh. The smell was impossible to hide. Perfumes, incense, even fresh herbs scattered across the floors. Nothing masked the stench of decay. Courtiers carried pomanders, pressing them to their noses when approaching. Some of the court's ladies would quietly excuse themselves to vomit after attending him. And then came a disturbing revelation. Henry's final portrait, the iconic Whitehall image we all know, hid a chilling truth. X-rays taken during 1960 restoration revealed that the king's left hand, shown holding a plain cane, had originally gripped a wooden staff topped with a human skull. This wasn't mere decoration. By then, Henry was consumed by death, carrying the skull everywhere. He would tap it against the floor while speaking, a habit that unsettled even his most loyal men. Rumor claimed it belonged to a monk from the dissolved monasteries. Others whispered it was from one of his executed enemies. Holbein had painted it faithfully, but after Henry's death, Edward VI ordered it painted over, unwilling to have his father remembered as a death-obsessed madman. Court records from those last months show a palace gripped by fear. Henry's moods swung so violently that courtiers created a secret warning system. Pages used colored ribbons to signal his state. Red for rage, black for depression, white for the rare moments of calm. Even the smallest offense could trigger him. A servant who sneezed during an audience was dragged away for questioning, as a suspected assassin armed with poison powder. A lady-in-waiting who once stepped on the king's robe by accident was banished from court. Her family's lands seized. Worst of all, Henry began ordering the execution of people who were already dead, forgetting he had sent them to the block years earlier. One of the most chilling moments came during a state banquet in November 1546. The French ambassador recorded how, in the middle of the meal, Henry suddenly rose, a painful process requiring several servants, and shouted at an empty chair. "You dare show your face at my table, witch!" he roared, pointing at nothing. The hall froze as he raged at what he clearly believed to be the ghost of Anne Boleyn. "I took your head once, I'll take it again." Then, as if nothing had happened, he slumped back into his seat and continued eating. By January 1547, at Whitehall Palace, Henry VIII entered his final decline, and what followed was so horrific that official records were hidden for centuries. Dr. Thomas Wendy's suppressed notes, found in a private collection in 1891, describe leg ulcers so deep that bone was visible. The flesh around them had blackened. Gangrene had set in. The smell was overpowering. Servants fainted while changing his sheets. Windows stayed open despite the freezing January air, because a closed room would fill with the reek of decay within minutes. His body had become a rotting shell. His skin turned a jaundiced yellow from liver failure. The whites of his eyes the same sickly hue, making him look almost inhuman. His tongue swelled so badly he could barely form words, the sounds emerging as wet, choking murmurs only his closest attendants could understand. His breath carried the stench of rotting meat, a sure sign the infection had spread into his digestive tract. His sheer size made caring for him almost impossible. It took 6 strong men just to roll him in bed to ward off sores, though by now they had appeared anyway, adding to the catalogue of decaying flesh. His legs were grotesquely swollen, the skin splitting in places and leaking clear fluid that soaked through piles of bandages each day. But one detail from his suffering still lingers in my mind. On January 20th, Henry showed the first signs of multiple organ failure. His kidneys, poisoned by years of toxins from his rotting legs, began to shut down. His urine, when it came at all, was dark brown, stinking of ammonia. His abdomen swelled with fluid, adding to his enormous bulk and pressing painfully on his organs. His mind flickered between frightening lucidity and wild delirium. In his clear moments, he understood he was dying. He begged his physicians to save him, promising them riches beyond measure. When they failed, he cursed them, threatening torture and death, though he no longer had the strength to sign the warrants. In his delirium, the full weight of his fear emerged. He cried out for his mother, gone nearly 40 years, begging her to protect him from demons he claimed were clawing their way from beneath his bed. He spoke to his long-dead brother Arthur, apologizing for taking his throne and his wife. Most pitifully, he called to his first queen, Catherine of Aragon, asking forgiveness, though she had died alone, abandoned, more than a decade before. Outwardly, the court kept up appearances. Official proclamations spoke of the king's recovery from a minor illness. Ambassadors were told he was merely resting and would greet them soon. But behind the scenes, Edward Seymour and the Privy Council were already arranging the succession, knowing Henry had only days left. On January 27th, Henry suffered what modern doctors would identify as a massive stroke. The right side of his face sagged grotesquely, drool soaking his pillow as he lost control of his muscles. His speech, already slurred from a swollen tongue, became entirely unintelligible. The king who had once reshaped a nation's religion with his voice could no longer even ask for water. Yet even in this state, paralyzed, rotting, Henry tried to cling to power. With his one working hand, he attempted to sign death warrants. His final intended victim was the Duke of Norfolk, a loyal servant for decades who had recently fallen from favor. The signature was no more than an ink-stained scrawl, but the terrified court still prepared to carry out the order. Only Henry's death the next day spared Norfolk from the block. And here is where the story turns toward the truth history tried to bury. Henry VIII did not die quietly in his sleep, as the official version claims. He died screaming. Archbishop Cranmer's private diary, found in the Lambeth Palace Library in 1983, contains the only eyewitness account of his last hours. Summoned near midnight on January 27 to deliver last rites, Cranmer entered the king's chamber to a sight that shook even him. Henry was in the grip of violent seizures, 6 men straining to hold him down to keep him from breaking bones. His enormous frame convulsed with such force that the reinforced bed frame cracked. Between spasms, he vomited black bile, clear evidence of massive internal bleeding in his digestive tract. The stench was overwhelming. Cranmer recorded leaving the room twice to vomit. In the brief moments when the convulsions eased, Henry's eyes would lock on things no one else could see. He called out for the children he had lost, miscarriages and stillbirths from his long, desperate quest for an heir, begging their forgiveness. He swore he would be a better father if they would only return to him. Then his voice shifted, rising high and panicked, as he screamed about flames, ordering someone to put out a fire only he could see. As the clock neared 2 in the morning on January 28th, his breathing changed to the wet, gurgling sound doctors now call the death rattle, the lungs filling with fluid. Cranmer, holding to Protestant doctrine, urged the king to give a sign if he trusted in Christ for salvation. Taking Henry's massive, swollen hand in his own, he asked for a squeeze if the king died in the faith of Jesus Christ. Henry squeezed once, weakly, then his hand went limp. At 2:07 a.m., January 28, 1547, King Henry VIII was dead. But the horror was far from over. It was only beginning. His corpse began to decay with alarming speed. The infections that had consumed him in life did not stop. They accelerated. Within hours, his bloated body swelled further as gases built up inside. The smell, impossibly, grew worse. Servants outside the chamber could be heard retching. The Privy Council, led by Edward Seymour, decided to keep the death secret for 3 days, not only for political reasons, but because they needed to determine how to deal with the rapidly decomposing body. Henry was too large and too far gone to be displayed without scandal. Embalmers were called in urgently, but they were faced with an impossible task. When the embalmers opened Henry's body to remove the organs, the full scale of the decay was revealed. His liver, grotesquely enlarged and diseased, crumbled at the slightest touch. His heart, nearly twice its normal size, was surrounded by thick yellow fluid. The intestines were blackened with gangrene. When the stomach was cut open, the concentrated stench was so overpowering that one assistant fainted and others fled the room. For 2 frantic days they worked, using methods extreme even by Tudor standards, packing the body cavity with over 100 pounds of salt and aromatic herbs, wrapping the remains in wax cloth soaked in turpentine, then sealing it inside a massive lead coffin reinforced to bear the weight. Yet even these desperate measures could not stop the rot. During the lying in state at Whitehall, witnesses reported strange noises from the coffin, pops and gurgles as gases built up inside. The lead began to bulge, and officials quickly draped extra black cloth to conceal the distortion. On February 14th, the coffin began its journey to Windsor Castle. Weighing nearly half a ton, it needed a specially built carriage drawn by 8 horses. The trip that should have taken a single day stretched to 3 as winter rains turned the roads to mud and the animals strained under the load. On the second night, the procession stopped at Sion Abbey. Ironically, one of the monasteries Henry himself had dissolved. The coffin was placed in the chapel overnight. What happened next was so grotesque it became legend, yet contemporary records confirm it. The pressure from the gases inside Henry's decomposing corpse had reached its limit. The lead coffin split open with a sound witnesses likened to a thunderclap. Putrid fluid spilled across the chapel floor, the stench so overpowering that guards abandoned their posts. By morning came the final humiliation. Workers found that dogs had entered the chapel overnight and were licking the foul liquid that had leaked from the king's coffin. The man who called himself God's anointed, who had defied Rome to assert his divine right to rule, ended as food for scavenging dogs. Palace staff scattered sawdust and lime to soak up the mess, working with cloths tied over their faces. The coffin was hurriedly resealed with fresh lead, but the damage to royal dignity was beyond repair. When the procession reached Windsor Castle, Henry was buried quickly, without the grand ceremony once planned. The scene had been so ruinous to the crown's image that Edward Seymour, now Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector, ordered every witness to silence under pain of death. The official record claimed Henry died peacefully and was buried with all honors. The truth remained hidden for centuries, preserved only in private diaries and foreign reports. Thus ended Henry VIII, the king who executed wives, destroyed monasteries, and ruled through fear. Rotting from within, screaming in terror, his corpse bursting in its coffin, and his remains lapped up by dogs. The Golden Renaissance prince, once called the handsomest ruler in Christendom, died a 400-pound ruin of infection and decay, abandoned by the courtiers who had once bowed at his feet. If this hidden history gripped you, you'll want to see my next investigation, where I reveal the real reason Anne Boleyn was executed, and it's nothing like what you learned in school. Click here to uncover the French spy connection that rewrites Tudor history. Subscribe for more suppressed truths, and I'll see you in the next investigation.